In this session, we're going to look at variable costs. Now, variable costs are the costs we do expect to change when our level of activity changes. So if we produce and sell tables, then the wood used for the tabletops will be a variable cost. Every time we produce an additional table, we are going to have to incur the additional cost for that extra tabletop. The more units we produce, or the more tables we produce, the higher the cost of the wood will be in total. So a variable cost are costs which vary in proportion to level of activity. In total terms. And an example of a variable cost would be our direct materials, or perhaps any royalty we pay for each unit we produce. If we consider then how our variable costs appear on a graph, again we've got our total costs on the y-axis and our level of activity on the x-axis. Remember, when we're graphing these cost behaviors, the first question we want to ask is, when our level of activity is 0, what will the total cost be? So for our variable costs, like our direct materials, when our level of activity is 0, what will our total variable cost be? Well, if we're not going to produce or sell any of our units or any of our tables at all, then our total variable cost is going to be 0. If we don't produce and sell any units, then we're not going to pay for any direct materials, and we're not going to pay any royalties, and so on. So when level of activity is 0, total variable cost is 0. As our level of activity increases, our total cost will increase in proportion to our level of activity. So if level of activity goes up 10%, then total variable cost will also go up 10%. Likewise, if level of activity decreases, then our variable costs in total will decrease as well. What about our variable cost per unit? Well, just like we did with fixed costs, let's look at, for a number of different levels of activity, what our total variable cost will be and what our variable cost per unit will be. Let's start with 1. So if our level of activity is 1 unit, I'm going to say that our total variable cost at that level of activity would be £5. So based on that, what is our variable cost per unit? We can calculate it as our total variable cost divided by our level of activity. So our variable cost per unit is £5. What if we increased our level of activity to 2 units? Now we have doubled our level of activity. If we double our level of activity, remember, our total variable cost is going to increase in proportion to level of activity. So if our activity has doubled, our total variable cost will also double. So it'll be £5 times 2. So if we calculate then our variable cost per unit as total variable cost divided by the number of units, we'll get 5. Let's increase our level of activity again. This time we're going to say our level of activity might go up to 20 units. If our level of activity goes up to 20, what will our total variable cost be? Well, if we've gone from a level of activity of 2 units to 20 units, then we've multiplied our activity level by 10. So our total variable costs will also multiply by 10. So now our total variable costs will be 10 by 10. So 100. What will our variable cost per unit be? Total variable costs divided by the number of units, 20, gives us 5. Again, variable cost per unit will usually remain constant. The variable cost per unit is the additional expense or cost we incur each time we produce another unit. So total variable cost increases or decreases in proportion to level of activity. Variable cost per unit is constant. If we were to show our variable cost per unit on a graph, this time we've got our cost per unit on the y-axis and our level of activity on the x-axis. So we'll ask our first question. What will the variable cost per unit be when our level of activity is 0? Well, it might be tempting to say 0, but actually when our level of activity is 0, our variable cost per unit, so the amount we would spend if we produced an additional unit, will still be £5. It's theoretical because we're not actually spending that money. As our level of activity increases, the variable cost per unit will stay the same. So it'll always cost us an extra £5 to produce an additional unit. So this is our variable cost per unit, which is constant.